Hello and welcome to World Talks here on TVP World. I'm Diana Skaya. The spotlight today is on Mar-a-Lago, where Volodymyr Zelenskyy is holding high-stakes talks with Donald Trump. On the table, a revised peace plan, security guarantees, and a new U.S. Ukraine economic framework. But now, could this meeting mark a turning point in the war? Richard Giragosian, the founding director of the Regional Studies Center, joins me now from Armenia. All right, Richard, good evening. So glad to have you here with us on World Talks. Richard, as this meeting is still currently ongoing, from what we've heard so far, the initial moments, what do you make of these first few hours of this crucial meeting?
Well, two observations to begin. First of all, as the Ukrainian and American presidents are going over a revised peace plan, it is not a peace process. In other words, Russia, as the aggressor, is actually missing from these negotiations. And that casts doubt on both the sincerity and the efficacy of whatever is reached. The second observation, as already noted, there's a false equivalency. There's almost blaming the victim in terms of the Trump administration's rather punitive approach toward Ukraine, where instead of punishing the aggression from Russia, they are looking for a mutual compromise, which actually questions the veracity of providing security guarantees for Ukraine and a lack of deterrence to prevent renewed hostilities from Russia.
All right, Richard, you said a lot of important points right there. I actually have them noted down, but let me ask you this first. So first of all, you're saying here that the Russians are not present here at the table this time around. However, Trump said that following the meeting, he is going to call Vladimir Putin, and reportedly he also held a call with Putin before the meeting took place, which according to the Kremlin lasted an hour. So my question to you, Richard, is the following. Is Vladimir Putin trying very hard to convince Trump to not give in to anything that Zelenskyy wants or any of Zelenskyy's revised plan, a bit like what we saw last time Zelenskyy met Trump a while back?
I think you raise a good point. That's a very good question, because what we see is a degree of Russian caution, not wanting to upset the Trump administration at this delicate stage. At the same time, however, there is a tendency by President Trump to accommodate Russia when it doesn't deserve accommodation. Moreover, I do think Russia has become very, very good at being very bad at fulfilling promises and expectations. So I do think the burden of proof is more on Russians' position rather than Ukraine.
Richard, is Putin playing Trump as he did the West?
Well, I think clearly yes. The stakes are rather high, rather dangerous. But I do think, unfortunately, despite the failed invasion of Ukraine, despite the military losses of the Russian side, I do think they are dictating to a degree what the Americans are trying to accomplish.
Richard, earlier on in the first question, I did ask you, you did mention compromise and you mentioned security guarantees. I want to know what you think about that. What can Zelenskyy possibly walk out with this time around? He wants hardcore security guarantees, right? That whatever happened years ago, right, with the Budapest Memorandum doesn't repeat itself again. But let me ask you this. How do we know that in 20 years from now, say an agreement does happen, that the same scenario won't unfold again, that Russia won't again attack Ukraine?
We don't know this. And in fact, according to sources in Washington, there is no mention of NATO membership for Ukraine. The so-called security guarantees that are being proposed are referring to an unspecified, unclarified date of membership in the European Union, but not the NATO alliance, meaning that militarily, Ukraine is only offered U.S. private investment in terms of a U.S. offer on the table to form an investment fund for the reconstruction of Ukraine, with an initial offer from the Americans of $100 billion in this investment fund. This is what they're talking about today. Security is too low on the list of priorities, unfortunately, for the Trump administration. So this kind of false equivalency and this kind of punitive peace only encourages Russia to violate the terms in the near future.
All right, Richard, let me talk about here territorial concessions. How do you think this will play out in this meeting? Do you think that Zelenskyy is going to be forced into it?
Well, he already is. In other words, what we do know from Florida today, there are two major sticking points in this second revised American peace plan. First is the requirement of a Ukrainian withdrawal from areas of Donetsk in the east, and hopefully a reciprocal withdrawal and pullback by Russian forces, with the idea being a demilitarized zone is to be formed. This is good. However, Russia has not accepted this. Ukraine has. The second sticking point is the Ukrainian nuclear power plant, which is the largest in Europe and whose future and current status depends on this agreement. Currently, it's in Russian hands. And this is a second major sticking point. So I don't think Ukraine and Russia are closer to peace. I think the Americans are trying to compel the Ukrainians to try to compromise.
Richard, the revised plan reportedly would include Article 5-like security guarantees for Ukraine. What would those be, and how likely is it that Donald Trump is going to agree to be a side to provide those guarantees?
I'm very skeptical. In other words, the key clarification here is Article 5-like security guarantees, not a commitment to collective defense. Moreover, the Trump administration has been only increasing doubt and concern over American unreliability and its lack of commitment to the NATO alliance. Therefore, the Trump administration is doing everything basically in full confidence to demonstrate that there is no confidence in these security guarantees. And I really think the embarrassment for the Americans will be Russia rebuffing their latest attempt at this second revised, diluted peace plan.
Richard, one of Russia's demands, I just want to go back to the territorial concessions for a moment here, was Ukraine giving up Donbass in parts where it's held by Ukraine. Is that even an option at this point?
Fortunately, no. And I say fortunately because the Ukrainians are not willingly going to surrender everything. And this capitulation is both unnecessary and also uncalled for. The Russian side can actually bargain and seek as much as it wants, but this is very much a demand far unacceptable for both sides.
Richard, what do you make of that? Of a couple of days ago, Zelenskyy said that he was willing to bring that latest version, the 20-point plan, up to a referendum if Russia actually agreed to a 60-day ceasefire. What do you make of that?
I think it was smart. It was smart both politically, but also tactically in negotiations, because it actually challenges Russia. It puts the burden of responsibility where it belongs, on Russia's response. So in other words, as Zelenskyy is bending over backwards to accommodate the American strategic interests, it is now Russia's turn to isolate itself further and reject any opportunity for a genuine ceasefire. So I think it was a smart tactic by President Zelenskyy.
Richard, I want us to take a look for a moment. If our control room could just give us back those images and those videos of the meeting happening right now. Richard, I want you to take a moment and just to see, we had Marco Rubio at that table. We have Donald Trump. We have Zelenskyy. We also see Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner. What do you make of these, this Donald Trump's staff, if that's what I can call them, at this table. I mean, what is Kushner doing there exactly?
Well, I'm quite worried because what this reflects is President Trump's emphasis on a real estate deal, on seeking a Nobel Peace Prize. It's not necessarily following U.S. national interest, nor defending democracies like Ukraine. It's a business deal. And this is also why the administration has already made it clear that it's looking for Ukrainian natural resources and critical minerals. In other words, the private sector from the American side is no guarantee of security. And I do think it shows the rather reckless unreliability of the Americans today, unfortunately.
Richard, I mean, Putin, of course, has violated agreements many, many times before. If he was to strike again, do you think the West would respond militarily?
That's a good question, and I think a clarification is in order. I don't think the West will respond. I think the European Union will respond. In other words, what we see is now a widening divergence in what was known as the West. The U.S. is going in a different direction than many leading European countries, including Poland. So I do think European military response and a robust reaction is both likely and expected in defense of Ukraine. After all, this is about European security. It's not only about Ukraine.
And Richard, finally, I am going to ask you, I mean, again, looking at that meeting unfold, as difficult as this question may be, will we wake up to a new reality tomorrow?
I would say a disturbing, distressing reality. I'm usually an optimist, but if we look at the recent Russian missile attacks and drone attacks on Kiev and Ukrainian cities today, we have little ground for optimism. And I do think lessons from history demonstrate we need to take a firm stand against aggression before it's too late.
Richard Giragosian, thank you so much for being with us here on World Talks to discuss the latest meeting currently being held in Mar-a-Lago between President Zelenskyy and President Trump. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching this edition of World Talks here on TVP World. I'm Skaya. See you next time.